In 1946, C.S. Lewis declared that a short book by the Scottish author George MacDonald, Phantastes, had baptized his imagination. A decade later, Lewis enthusiastically repeated this assertion in his best-selling memoir, Surprised by Joy, and thus sealed the reputation of MacDonald's Phantastes as one of the most purchased, unfinished books to be found on people's Inklings bookshelves. Ever since, there have been readers who eagerly pick the book up, dive in, get befuddled, and put it away, oft forever. Not everyone. I've known a few people who don't even consider themselves serious readers who've loved this book from the get-go. But the numbers of those who do quickly get baffled or bogged down are considerable, even amongst Inkling scholars. So do not feel embarrassed if you are that number. But don't give up either. The purpose of this talk is to equip you for either a return to that text or perhaps even to tempt you to dive in for the first time. Lewis reread Phantastes innumerable times throughout his life. It truly was one of his favorite books. And it would take weeks of discussion to even begin to unpack it. But it's my hope that today's talk will serve as a bit of an orientation for anyone game for an expedition into fairy. Before we turn to MacDonald and the novel, though, let's take a little closer of a look at Lewis's passion for it and what he understands it to have done to him and for him. And let's start first at the end. In 1962, 17 months before his death. At that point, Lewis was completing a successful career as a medieval and Renaissance scholar and professor, an apologist, and an author of best-selling popular fiction. Not a common combination. An American journal asked him to list the books which, quote, did most to shape his vocational attitude and his philosophy of life, end quote. At the very top of the list, before Boethius, before Herbert, and even before Virgil, Lewis named this short novel, written in 1858, Phantastes, a fairy romance for men and women. That's an astonishing accolade for a work of fantasy. Did most to shape his vocational attitude and philosophy of life. Yet even if one knew Lewis so little as to suppose that he did not give his answer much forethought, it is all the more astonishing that his declaration remained an almost lifelong position. When he was a teenager, Phantastes had, he writes, called him across a great frontier. In a now famous phrase, Lewis declared that through his experience of reading that book, my imagination was, in a certain sense, baptized. And it was here, he later wrote, that he first found in print the yearning experience of servanthood. Lewis writes, that evening, I began to read my new book. The woodland journeyings in that story, the ghostly enemies, the ladies, both good and evil, were close enough to my habitual imagery to lure me on without the perception of a change. As if I had died in the old country and could never remember how I came alive in the new. I knew I had crossed a great frontier. I had already been waist deep in romanticism, and likely enough at any moment to flounder into its darker and more evil forms, slithering down the steep descent that leads from the love of strangeness to that of eccentricity, and thence to that of perversity. Now, Phantastes was romantic enough in all conscience, but there was a difference. Nothing was at that time further from my thoughts than Christianity, and therefore I had no notion what this difference really was. I was only aware that if this new world was strange, it was also homely and humble. That if this was a dream, it was a dream in which one at least felt strangely vigilant. That the whole book had about it a sort of cool morning innocence, and also quite unmistakably a certain quality of death. Good death. What it actually did to me was to convert, even to baptize, and that's where the death came in, my imagination. We now know from archived letters that the 17-year-old Lewis immediately wrote to his intimate friend, Arthur Greaves, about the discovery and some of that experience. One teenager to another. I have had a great literary experience this week. I have discovered yet another author to add to our circle, our very own set. Never since I first read The Well at the World's End have I enjoyed a book so much. And indeed, I think my new find is quite as good as Mallory or Morris himself. The book, to get to the point, is George MacDonald's fairy romance Phantastes. Have you read it? I suppose not, as if you had, you could not have helped telling me about it. At any rate, whatever book you're reading now, you simply must get this at once. And must is in capital letters. Of course, it is hopeless for me to try and describe it, but when you have followed the hero Anados along that little stream to the fairy wood, have heard about the terrible ash tree and how the shadow of his gnarled knotted hands falls upon the book the hero is reading, and when you've read about the fairy palace, just like that picture in the Dulac book, and heard the episode of Cosmo, I know that you will quite agree with me. You must not be disappointed at the first chapter, which is rather conventional fairy tale style. And after it, you won't be able to stop until you've finished. Talking about finishing books, I have at last come to the end of The Fairy Queen. And though I say at last, I almost wish he had lived to write 6 more books, as he'd hoped to do. So much have I enjoyed it. I included that last sentence about Spenser's Fairy Queen for 2 reasons. First, to remind ourselves that Lewis was a rather precocious reader for a teenager. And 2, that having already read The Fairy Queen and Mallory's Morte d'Arthur, he has an extra step up and into Phantastes. And over the following years, Lewis wrote to Greaves, this friend of his, repeatedly about Phantastes. It became a kind of touchstone for them. He continued to write to Greaves about MacDonald's books in general for another 42 years, in fact. And Lewis stayed with Phantastes through his 20s. In 1923, surviving the traumas of World War I and whilst a student at Oxford, he writes in his diary that Phantastes, which by then he claims to have read many times, has become a sort of devotional book for him. Those are the words he uses, devotional book. He adds that reading it tuned me up to a higher pitch and delighted me. That's what reading Phantastes did to him in his 20s. And so he kept on rereading it. At the age of 28, now Oxford faculty, Lewis wrote to a friend of how Phantastes had given him a great shaking up. He continued to loan and to recommend it to people to read. 10 years on, in his now famous correspondence with Sister Penelope, there he is discussing Irenaeus, free will, and Phantastes again. He suggests that Phantastes is a great book for those in convalescence and talks of how it taught him of holiness long before he had a name for it. Yet another 10 years and Lewis is recommending Phantastes to those struggling with understanding the concept of truth. He writes in another letter, "Isn't Phantastes good? It did a lot for me years before I became a Christian, when I had no idea what was behind it. This has always made it easier for me to understand how the better elements in mythology can be a real preparatio evangelica for people who do not yet know whither they are being led." In the late 50s, a friend offered Lewis a first edition of the book. But Lewis suggested that that should really belong to the university archives at MacDonald's alma mater in Aberdeen. In 1955, he writes, "The quality which had enchanted me in MacDonald's imaginative works turned out to be the quality of the real universe, the divine, magical, terrifying, and ecstatic reality in which we all live. I should have been shocked in my teens if anyone had told me that what I had learned to love in Phantastes was goodness." And then when asked in the 60s, 64 years old and only months before his death, Lewis declared what could not by then be a shock to any who knew him well, that Phantastes, a fairy romance for men and women, topped the list of books that did most to shape his vocational attitude and his philosophy of life. Phantastes is not the only MacDonald text to which Lewis gives great homage. For instance, both before and after his spiritual transformation in 1931, Lewis was reading from George MacDonald's Diary of an Old Soul, a book-length poem, every night before bed, usually with a cup of cocoa, according to his letters. Intentionally this time as a devotional text. He got his brother doing the same thing, by the way, a practice that Warnie continued even after Lewis had died. An autographed copy of Diary of an Old Soul was Lewis's first ever Christmas present to his future wife, Joy. So it's no surprise then that Lewis writes of his conversion. When the process was complete, by which of course I mean when it had really begun, I found out that I was still with MacDonald, and that he had accompanied me all the way, and that I was now at last ready to hear from him much that he could not have told me at that first meeting. But in a sense, what he was now telling me was the very same that he had told me from the beginning. There was no question of getting through to the kernel and throwing away the shell. No question of a gilded pill. The pill was gold all through. I haven't tallied it up yet, but Lewis must have bought almost the entire corpus of MacDonald's books. He definitely owned at least 25. In 1933, Lewis supervised quite possibly the first student thesis on MacDonald. And in 1946, not only does Lewis have MacDonald appear as the Virgil de Dante character in The Great Divorce, but he also publishes an anthology of MacDonald's writings, explaining in the preface that the reason he is publishing this book is that he does not believe that those who read his writings yet accept or understand just how much those writings owe to George MacDonald. He says this: "In making this collection, I was discharging a debt of justice. I have never concealed the fact that I regarded him, George MacDonald, as my master. Indeed, I fancy I have never written a book in which I did not quote from him. But it has not seemed to me that those who have received my books kindly take even now sufficient notice of the affiliation. Honesty drives me to emphasize it." He almost sounds a little bit exasperated. In reading through the letters, one could really say that Lewis never ceased badgering his friends, let alone his readership, to read George MacDonald. And writing to one friend about important teachers of faith, whilst Lewis mentions Augustine, Boethius, Hooker, others, he explains that it is to George MacDonald that he owes his own greatest debt. Most particularly, he adds, to George MacDonald's unspoken sermons. I could carry on, but I am hoping that this is sufficient to convince you, without a doubt, that to be a scholar of Lewis studies, carefully considering the text of Phantastes is not really optional. For the aficionado, it's obviously not compulsory, but if you wish to understand Lewis better, this is a significant key. Lewis was clearly passionate about MacDonald's writing throughout his adult life. It was not a passing fancy. Relentless in his recommendation of various MacDonald texts, even whilst asserting perceived imperfections, his letters are full of chatter back and forth about his thoughts on reading and rereading various volumes. With this, clearly one of the most significant texts for Lewis scholarship. So now you may understand my surprise, considering the litany that I've just given, when I first moved to Oxford in 1998, a young and eager scholar, excited to hold rigorous discussions about the finer points in which Lewis engages with MacDonald with the Lewis scholars based there. And I couldn't find any. none active in the field, who had even read Phantastes straight through. A few had Lewis's MacDonald anthology on their shelves, but like most people with a quotation anthology, they'd barely cracked the spine. It was, in fact, to pacify me in my horror that Michael Ward, not too long out of his undergrad, asked if I'd give a lecture to the Oxford C.S. Lewis Society, because although many of its members did own a copy of Phantastes, I don't think any had actually read this pretty short book to completion. Now, I should mention two notable Oxford exceptions. The professors Francis Warner and Alistair McGrath. Francis Warner was C.S. Lewis's last graduate student, and Alistair McGrath has since written a biography on Lewis, but that was about 15 years before then. He had actually read both MacDonald and most of the critical studies on MacDonald at that point, more broadly than anyone else I'd come across. I am indebted to both men for their encouragement to me personally. I don't want to spend the limited time we have today delving into all the reasons why Lewis's attempt to direct his readers to one of his primary influences continues to be largely ignored, or why the short book has proven to be such a big challenge to so many Lewis scholars, let alone readers, because I hope to do something that I think is much more important. I hope to better facilitate your own relationship with the text itself. I will seek to do so first by setting it in its context, and then by walking with you through a bit of the story. But first, it is worth making a quick-sided note that I think part of the stumbling block with Phantastes for Lewis scholars concerns identity. Cambridge medieval and Renaissance scholar Helen Cooper, an inheritor of Lewis's chair at Cambridge, has argued very eloquently that until criticism starts paying attention to Lewis's identity as his chosen profession of a medieval and Renaissance scholar, it will never fully understand the man or his writings. C.S. Lewis was not first and foremost a Christian apologist, although that was unarguably an important part of his identity. He was not even first and foremost an author of fantasy literature, also a key part of his identity. Those two important aspects of the intriguing C.S. Lewis cannot be understood apart from his passion and lifelong vocation as a professor, scholar, and critic of medieval and Renaissance literature. This rather relevant issue is paralleled in the very similar oversight that has occurred in MacDonald scholarship. So much attention has been given to George MacDonald as one of the progenitors of fantasy literature in English, as well as to his very short, only months-long career as a church minister, that his primary vocational identity as a literature scholar has been largely overlooked. This oversight has not only impeded accurate scholarship, but it's led to further oversights, such as the failure to recognize MacDonald's role in developing the then young discipline of English literature. And of particular note concerning Phantastes, his significant involvement in the actual revival of England's medieval literature. I should note here that this is one of the reasons why I am so excited about recent projects like Amanda Vernon's work on MacDonald's critical studies and lectures, and the innovative research conducted by Joe Rickey and his students at Taylor University in regards to MacDonald as a Shakespeare scholar. These new forays are beginning to crack open the huge oversight and resulting misperceptions in the general failure to recognize MacDonald as a vocational literature scholar. And this is important because Phantastes did not only transform C.S. Lewis's imagination, beginning a reframing of his entire worldview, it drew him deep into the very literary world that was to become his lifelong career. And if anyone wants to better understand Lewis, not only as a fantasist, an imaginative mythopoeic writer, and an apologist, but also as that medieval and Renaissance scholar, then they need to pick up their copies of Phantastes and try to get lost in the same fairyland that informed and shaped their subject from his teenage years all the way up until the very end of his life. And so my goals today are not only to convince all of you to discover or to pursue an even deeper understanding of this text so key to your interest in Lewis, but also to introduce the text to you in a manner that will, I hope, make it more accessible. In discussing Phantastes with friends and colleagues, I long ago learned that when certain thematic threads are pointed out, that can pull readers in, helping to tie together the protagonist's adventures. Even understanding how Phantastes fits into the episodic genre of pilgrimage literature can help prepare the reader stylistically. But when I recently explained to some colleagues how biographic and contextual reading had clarified for me the dominant concept into which all these threads feed, even some longtime teachers of Phantastes saw the book in a new light. So I'm going to give you a bit of each now, with the conviction that whether you have read the book already or will someday, this introduction will facilitate your own deeper delving. For those of you unfamiliar with pre-20th century literature, it is also helpful to keep in mind that you are reading a book written in an age when the author did not pander yet to a busy, immediate gratification lifestyle. Phantastes was written when the expectation was, of course, you would not glean all the treasures on offer on a first read. Penny novels and lending libraries and the popularity of magazines and serializations would significantly change this approach to reading in the coming years. But few early Victorians were privileged enough to own many books, and a book was not something read through merely to discover what happened, then set aside, considered done. A book was read and reread, possibly on its own, but frequently with others aloud. The reader engaging with the text ever more deeply, each reading revealing new connections and presenting yet another journey. The reward of such books is great, but it requires investment. Lewis himself wrote that a first read of a good book reveals the plot and characters. It is in the rereading that we find wisdom and strength. This was clearly his own approach to Phantastes. Now, when I was an undergraduate, more than 30 years ago, a significant attention to biography and context in literary studies was scorned in many North American literature departments. This methodological trend, quite bizarre, frankly, to people not in the discipline, held reign for decades, and in some areas at least is only just now beginning to wane. Perhaps it is this very disregard for historical situation that has left most practitioners completely unaware that their own discipline was founded in part because its earliest professors, A.J. Scott and F.D. Morris, insisted upon the importance of biography and context. These founders did not disavow the value of close readings. They delighted in discussing theme and symbolism, imagery, rhetoric, even in discovering unintended treasures or acknowledging different interpretations. But they were deeply interested in literature as, to use Tolkien's term, subcreation. As such, they believed that conception and inception too should also be taken into account. To know something of the author and of how a piece of work came to be is to understand that piece of work better. Knowing that these men argued that a text did not stand independent of the human from whose lived experience that text was issued, it is hardly surprising that their student and C.S. Lewis's mentor, George MacDonald, did the same. He was adamant that to better understand the works that an author produced, one must consider what he calls the womb of a time into which an author is born. The pulses of that culture, the characters of his community, the company he kept. And so this perspective framed MacDonald's teaching. 40 years a lecturer in English literature, MacDonald also wrote literature that was jam-packed not only with implicit but with explicit references and introductions to other literary texts. Every book of MacDonald's is an intentional invitation to hundreds more. As a representative of the second generation of English literature professors, MacDonald is especially direct in his essays that if a reader really wishes to delve deeper into a text, then understanding biography, historical context, and corpus context is unnegotiable. And giving credence to his perspective is what led me to a whole new understanding of Phantastes. My experience generally with this critical approach is that most of the conundrums, perplexities, and contradictions that I have found in MacDonald criticism, that is, fairy tales express a faith crisis, that he was raised in an anti-literary federal Calvinist environment, that he was anti-science and uninterested in political issues, that he was primarily influenced by German romantics, etc., have been soundly refuted and clarified through a combination of primary research, contextual awareness, and corpus familiarity. The fuller my understanding becomes of MacDonald and his family and the Scotland, England, Italian Riviera of their lifetimes, the better I know the women and men who influenced him, the texts that he valued and quoted, the more familiar I am with his own corpus as a whole, the better I read, the more deeply I understand George MacDonald. And frankly, the more amazed I am by both his brain and his heart. Refining the approach when researching specific texts like Phantastes has proved and continues to prove equally fruitful. And so when I was asked to write a chapter on MacDonald for a book called King Arthur and the Inklings, examining Arthurian influence upon the Inklings, I was already aware of some of the key contextual issues. Arthurian references pervade his corpus. The two novels that are most explicitly Arthurian are the fantastical novel Phantastes and the realistic novel The Seaboard Parish. I knew that MacDonald's primary mentor, A.J. Scott, the first ever full-time English literature professor, had played a significant role in the 19th century medieval revival. And a significant number of those first medievalists were either his close friends or his students or both. Scott had dug up long-forgotten texts from the British Library. He had read Anglo-Saxon and Middle English to audiences who'd never even heard of those languages. He introduced such marvels as Beowulf to the English public. But of all the literature being returned to national consciousness, romantic medieval tales most riveted the public imagination. If you can believe it, Arthurian legend had largely been forgotten in Britain. It's hard to imagine now. Robert Southey's edition of Morte d'Arthur was the first published since before the English Civil War. But by the end of the century, the 19th century, Arthurian legend had become a national obsession. From political cartoons, to packed art galleries, through to mundane advertising. I also already knew that not only was MacDonald Scott and Morris's student in literature, but he was also deeply influenced by their zeal for social reform. These men fought for education for all people, regardless of class, gender, or religious affiliation. And they passionately believed that the most powerful tool for effecting this reform was the medium of story. Their fundamental basis for this conviction was the gospel. MacDonald was not their only adherent. The percentage of literature scholars and authors also involved in the 19th century social reform is quite astounding. What I did learn that was new to me was that this involvement in social reform was particularly evident amongst those involved in the medieval revival. Despite the diversity of these people in social backgrounds, in educational experiences, in theological, philosophical, political perspectives, an entire social network of academics and artists were not just keen on, but were actually inspired to social reform through England's early texts and myths. When I began to look more closely at specific texts and dates, I also discovered that George MacDonald's poetry was actually amongst the very first Arthurian literature of the period, predating even Alfred Lord Tennyson on several counts, and that Phantastes was written right when Arthuriana was the new hip trend in Victorian pop culture. And that when MacDonald's other Arthurian tale that I mentioned, The Seaboard Parish, was published a decade later, that trend had settled into an appropriated cultural norm. How MacDonald adjusts to that with his novel, The Seaboard Parish, is really quite fascinating, how he adjusts to that shift, that cultural shift, and changes what he writes. And you can read about that in the Inklings and King Arthur, edited by Sørina Higgins. But today our focus is going to be on what he's doing in Phantastes right at the beginning of that time. Early in the 19th century, the primary emphasis evoked by Arthurian legend had been its model of British Christian heroism. That had been the early model. But as legends entered the common vernacular, the emphasis shifted to knight heroes of contemporary society. The general population was more interested in medieval literature and Arthurian legend as mythic inspiration than as history, religious icon, or even literary text. Dis-ease with the rapid changes in Britain due to industrialization heightened the mass appeal of this seemingly simpler, cleaner, more heroic past. By the 1850s, when Phantastes was published, the popular concept of Arthurian England was that of an idealized realm. The allure was widespread. In a country that had for centuries forgotten such traditions as St. George and St. Michael and the dragons, suddenly Arthurian images adorned the Queen's robing room at the Parliament, the Oxford Students' Union, and many a village memorial to fallen soldiers. Gothic architecture pervaded public spaces. Societies for social reform bore such names as the Guild of St. George, and the arts and craft movement brought regal medieval design into middle-class homes. The notion that Arthurian chivalry should inform modern behavior, that one might imitate imagined Arthurian heroes, that pervaded the general culture. Yet, to whom that expectation applied remained fairly gender and class specific. A popular text on how to manifest chivalry in modern life defines chivalry as that which disposes men to heroic actions and keeps them conversant with all that is beautiful and sublime in the intellectual and moral world. A narrow designation that, gender, class, and educationally selective. So this is, to use MacDonald's phrase, the womb of time out of which the book Phantastes, a fairy romance for men and women. This is the womb of time out of which that book was birthed. Phantastes was not a mere reflection of the popular culture. It was a trailblazing challenge to it. Since 1845, early medievalists had been MacDonald's intellectual, social, and spiritual community, committed to the newly developed profession of teaching English literature, privately, in colleges, and through public lectures. MacDonald taught medieval tales and the subsequent literature that engaged with them, from Sidney to Spenser and Shakespeare, right up to contemporaries such as Tennyson. And he taught them to women, to working class men, to religious dissenters. But he also did more than just teach from the podium. Thoroughly convinced of the message that reform could, and that it would, be facilitated through story, he became one of the earliest Victorian scholars to compose his own fiction based on Arthurian themes. Phantastes was published even before Tennyson's Idylls. And unusual as it was, Phantastes arrived to a ready readership. It was an immediate, trendy hit. MacDonald was not simply taking advantage of a prevailing trend. From Phantastes onwards, he carefully manifested his mythopoeic approach to literature, engaging in new ways with old myths, crafting new stories to explore old truths, with a very attentive eye to his readership. As Arthurian legend became increasingly popular, interest in authenticity and accuracy to the medieval texts decreased significantly, thus increasing the propensity to use images to promote agendas, in particular those connecting Arthurian legend to national identity and an idea of English gallantry. And so that is where MacDonald cunningly met his audience. As I studied MacDonald's Arthurian text, one recurrent theme stuck out, one that I definitely recognized as being a significant Phantastes thread: servanthood. This evoked a particular passage that is repeated in multiple MacDonald texts, both verbatim and in approximation. It's clearly a concept that he was keen to communicate. The passage begins like this: "No man could rise to the honor of knighthood without service." The passage carries on to carefully trace the typical historical progression from child to squire to knight, a pilgrimage defined at every level by dedication to servanthood. This is how MacDonald explains it. No man could rise to the honor of knighthood without service. A nobleman's son even had to wait on his father, or go into the family of another nobleman and wait upon him as a page, standing behind his chair at dinner. This was an honor. No notion of degradation was in it. It was a necessary step to higher honor. And what was the next higher honor? To be set free from service? No. To serve in the harder service of the field. To be a squire to some noble knight. To tend his horse, to clean his armor, to see that every rivet was sound, every buckle true, every strap strong. To ride behind him and carry his spear, and if more than one attacked him, to rush to his aid. This service was the more honorable because it was harder, and was the next step to the higher honor yet. And what was this higher honor? That of knighthood. Wherein did this knighthood consist? The very word means simply service. And for what was the knight thus waited upon by his squire? That he might be free to do as he pleased? No, but that he might be free to be the servant of all. By being a squire first, the servant of one, he learned to rise to the higher rank, that of servant of all. Let me reread that culminating sentence in explanation of true knighthood. By being a squire first, the servant of one, he learned to rise to the higher rank, that of servant of all. Remembering the passion that MacDonald had caught from A.J. Scott for the linguistic element of literature, the identity and story of words, I checked the etymology myself. And sure enough, knight, knight, means one who serves. Thus armed, I returned to the text of Phantastes. I wish I had time to delve a little deeper into this with you. Instead, I have to gallop through the story to give a glimpse of how MacDonald turns a trend into a call, rerouting his readers in their own literary inheritance. But I hope this overview will equip you for your own journey into the text. Phantastes opens with a young Victorian gentleman, Anados, who has reached the age of legal responsibility, about to take charge of his family's castle estate, be guardian to his younger sisters, and to execute new responsibilities, such as overseeing the farm laborers. His duty is to manifest chivalry in modern life. But though of noble blood, and with grand ideas of gallantry, it is quickly evident that his is little more than a Victorian pop culture concept of chivalry. Anados knows the trends, but certainly not the text from which they came. That night, he is accosted by a fairy ancestress who chides him for knowing so little of his own genetic inheritance. When he awakens in the morning to assume his new role as Lord of the Manor, he discovers that his trendy neo-medieval arts and craft decor bedroom has been transformed into an actual sylvan bower. An immersion into his inheritance of fairy is about to challenge his entire 19th century understanding of chivalry and knighthood. For though Anados is certainly eager to face heroic action and believes himself intellectually conversant with the beautiful and sublime, a gentleman of England, his adventures quickly reveal that he is woefully far from being an English knight, that even his English blood has very little to do with true English knighthood. Our would-be hero commences on a journey of medieval romance, shaped and informed by stories from the Middle Ages right up to those contemporary. Each new adventure explores or reiterates from another angle what the English word knight technically means, and reveals Anados' struggle to fully comprehend. It is Anados' fairy blood that enables him to wander through these stories, and although Arthurian legends are prominent, they are not the only ones evident. Fairy is not contained by nationality. French contes de fées flow into German Märchen, flow into Celtic myth. One of Anados' first encounters is with a woman he identifies as being lower class. His astonishment at her intellectual capabilities reflects the attitude of many of his contemporaries in 19th century England, where back in the real England, some ongoing parliamentary arguments against education reform were based on the supposed inability of both lower classes and of all women to healthily sustain such an intellectual strain as university education. Anados, however, in Fairyland, is forced to acknowledge this woman's abilities and to accept her hospitality as well. Yet he remains aloof, and thus he misses the opportunity to learn important information from her. Nonetheless, under the auspices of her hospitality, he does begin to supplement his impoverished education, borrowing her great book of fairy tales in olden times and the Knights of King Arthur's Table. Thus, one of his first positive acts in Fairyland is not a physical engagement in adventure, but rather a reading of adventure. Anados reads for hours, specifically following the exploits of Sir Galahad and Sir Percival of the Round Table. Just as he's about to discover why in his tale Percival appears so disgraced along the shining Galahad, and how this relates to a certain evil maid, he is interrupted, and he reads no more. Not having learned of how to defend against the wiles of that evil maid on the page, later proves dire for Anados when he meets her in the flesh. Anados' errors of presumption continue. He ignores the warnings of someone called the repentant knight, precisely because an attitude of repentance over past failures does not match Anados' image of a dashing knight hero. Yet, repeatedly, his own attempts to prove himself knight-errant seek him deeper into errancy. As he eventually begins to recognize the selfish motivations behind even his seemingly good deeds, Anados starts to see the actions of the repentant knight in a new light. But continued self-oriented errors, eventually lead him to abusing the trust of a young maid. His resultant self-loathing can be healed only by food, drink, and ritual washing at the fairy palace. A greater maturity comes to him in this period of repose, during which day upon day of reading finally improves his fashion-fed knowledge of Victorian chivalry with the literary education that he has lacked. And he recognizes, as he's doing this reading, that this is a form of peregrination. This is a form of pilgrimage, as he vicariously journeys on these pages. The experiences are fortifying. We learn that long in the future, when he does return back to England, that the experiences in these stories now will continue to comfort and guide him in the time yet to come. Yet at that moment, the would-be knight is unable to realize that his new understandings found within these books, and they are new understandings, but they are yet cerebral. He must learn to put into practice what he is learning, or it will wither, or worse, corrupt. This is evidenced almost immediately when, attempting to free an imprisoned white lady, Anados himself is too free. He assumes the champion's right to the damsel. His vision of chivalric glory, even for all the tales that he has just read, is still self-oriented: to conquer evil, win the maiden, gain the glory. Anados has much to learn in his relationships with women before he earns the adage of knight, rather than that of a mere gallant. He must eschew his chauvinist attitude that a woman is either something to be rescued and claimed if beautiful and noble, bested if a temptress, or ignored if common. This progress takes him time, even though right from the very beginning of his adventures, he was both rescued and instructed by various females. Women sacrifice much for Anados on his journey, and they continue to rescue him throughout. It is quite late in the tale that Anados is finally able to recognize true knights. Through his relationship with these brothers, he finally understands that a knight does not rush headlong from one glorious rescue to another, but must labor. That mental, emotional, and physical rigor are required in order to serve well. Anados also learns the importance of preparation for future endeavors and of seeking advice. But he still believes that he can be a knight on his own. Thinking that he's now got it figured out, he becomes cavalier about the shadow that continues to haunt him. And he numbers himself, he says, amongst the glorious knights of old, even and equal to Galahad. His self-delusion eventually results in solitary confinement. Only when he is rescued by a lowly female, one that he himself had earlier wronged, is Anados able to recognize that this young woman, she is a truly valiant individual, not he who would be champion. At that point, he strips himself of his armor, declaring that he could possibly be a squire, but that he now honored knighthood too highly to dare make claim of it. It's a bit of a shift. Anados' comprehension of what it means to be a knight is radically improved, but it is not until he willingly puts himself in service to one who himself intentionally seeks to be a servant, the repentant knight, that he really comes to understand. This knight makes no distinction between low and high-born for his chivalric missions. He is as ready to rescue a princess, a queen, a prince, as he is a peasant or a child. Although this knight has already won his damsel, over whom he does not rule, but rather with whom he confers, that is shown and modeled. And although he's already achieved the valiant shine of Galahad, he yet continues to choose to face deep peril, regardless of whether he gets a reward or not. The adventures of this knight that are detailed are a striking contrast to Anados' own treatment of his peasant hostess earlier in the tale. Anados now understands that the knight's countenance is noble, not because he is highborn, but because of the love etched upon it. The knight explains that he seeks not renown and success, but simply to serve as best he can, with a cool brain and a strong will. When Anados objects that one might not always succeed, the knight rejoins, perhaps not in the individual act, but the result of his lifetime will content him. And Anados finally recognizes that this is nobility. This is true knighthood. Once Anados understands what being a knight actually means, his time in fairyland is complete, proving that he is finally able to put into deed a nobleness that is true. He commits a sacrificial act that he knows will cost his life, and thus he dies fully to self. He's allowed a taste of the land of death, time to reflect on his journeying in fairyland, but as soon as he vows a future of selfless service, he's abruptly returned alive to his home in England, where his sisters remark upon how much he has changed. Now, actually prepared to assume his role as Lord of the Manor. Anados explains, I began the duties of my new position somewhat instructed, I hoped, by the adventures that had befallen me in fairyland. Could I translate the experience of my travels there into common life here? This was the question. And it is, if you will, the Narnian question, right? Can we translate the experience of our travels there, in those stories, in those books, into common life here? Common life here. Anados knows that he will continue to face trials and even failures. He must stay on guard, laboring in mental, emotional, and physical preparation, so that he is ready to come to the rescue of any and everyone who needs his aid. He is now a true knight, rather than an aspiring hero. Knowing that at times he will be defeated, he yet will continue to serve. His memories of his fairy adventures, those read, observed, and partaken, will fortify him as he puts into practice the actions required of an English knight, a goal unrestricted by class, gender, or religious affiliation, as the full title of his tale serves to remind. Now, that was a bit of a mad dash, but I hope it helps illuminate not only this text, but also some of the ways in which George MacDonald inspired C.S. Lewis in particular, and even the Inklings generally. How his model participation in the long tradition of literary engagement engendered the mythopoeic literature they so admired. MacDonald's art encouraged the development of new perceptions informed by attention to one's inheritance. Rather than simply riding a trend, his response to a cultural hunger for identity and a cultural need for reform was to reintroduce that culture to its roots, to engage the spirit of the age with its own ancient tales of transformation, enabling his readers to converse with voices of the past, of their own past. In doing so, MacDonald helped engender a whole new genre of literature. In doing so, he challenged would-be gallants to be true knights, to learn to be servants of all. And thus, in attending to the particular truths of his own age, as informed by great literary voices of the past, MacDonald crafted a tale that transformed readers, even into the next century, like Lewis. And for those willing to read a work of fantasy that will challenge them, both intellectually and philosophically, possibly even spiritually, this text does have potential to transform readers in yet another century, the 21st. I hope that this introduction, this placing of Phantastes in its setting, will help enlighten your own reading of the text. I've only set it up with hopes of better facilitating your own adventure. You have to open up the covers and step inside and discover how the tale happens. I will close with a quotation from Lewis as a warning, though. Remember, for him, the act of reading this text had lifelong ramifications. He writes that, I had not the faintest notion of what I had let myself in for by buying Phantastes. For this culturally shocking tale of a man who, on his quest for knighthood, is rescued repeatedly by women, hosted and educated by peasants, and finally realizes his goal once he learns to serve others regardless of status or potential reward. This tale is, well, it's like Aslan. It's not at all tame. According to Lewis, it goes beyond the expression of things we have already felt. It arouses in us sensations we have never had before, never anticipated having, as though we had broken out of our normal mode of consciousness and possessed joys not promised to our birth. It gets under our skin. It hits us at a deeper level than our thoughts or even our passions. It troubles old certainties till all questions are reopened, and in general shocks us more fully awake than we are for most of our lives. Read it. Read it closely. But reader, beware.